Welcome to the United States Capitol Historical Society series of interviews with Asian Pacific American members of Congress. I'm Donald Kennan, Vice President and Chief Historian of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. It is my privilege to introduce Congressman David Wu of Oregon. In October of 1961, at 6 years of age, David Wu moved with his family to the United States from his native Taiwan. He was educated in public schools, earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Stanford University in 1977, attended Harvard Medical School, and received a law degree from Yale University in 1982. In 1988, he co-founded the law firm of Cohen and Wu. For a decade, the firm successfully served the high technology industry and numerous small businesses across Northwest Oregon's Silicon Forest. David Wu was first elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1998 and was subsequently re-elected in 2000, 2002, 2004, and 2006. Congressman Wu is the first and only Chinese American to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. He currently is a member of the Executive Board for the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus and served as its chair from January 2001 to January 2004. Congressman Wu is also a member of the New Democratic Coalition, a group of moderate Democrats in the House. Welcome, Congressman Wu, and we thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Donald, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Congressman, in our first interview in the Yielding the Floor series, Tom Foley and Bob Michel spoke about how moved they were the first time they were sworn in as a member of Congress. What were your thoughts the first time you took the oath of office?
Well, you know, in terms of the moving aspect of that day, that really occurred before swearing in with the first light of day. My parents, my wife and family and I were staying at the Holiday Inn in Southwest Washington, and right at the crack of dawn, before the sun was up, I remember coming to the window and looking out toward the Capitol Dome, which we could see by leaning a little bit, and with the first light of the morning on the dome, thinking, I'm going to be part of that. And that was the truly moving part of my first day. I think at the actual swearing-in ceremony, it was actually a little bit more humorous. As you know, I spent a stint of time in medical school, and when I left, I knew that my parents, and particularly my dad, was not very happy about me leaving medical school before getting a degree. And we had gotten enough tickets to get my wife, my in-laws, and my parents into the gallery. And as I was raising my right hand and taking the oath of office, the thing that flew through my mind, I could sort of barely see my parents up in the gallery, and the thing that came through my mind was actually, I wonder if my dad's still upset about that medical school thing.
Many members recall that a senior member or a group of members took them under the wing and mentored them during their early years in Congress. Did anyone mentor you or have a particular influence on your developing congressional career?
Well, you know, one of the many helpful experiences that I remember most clearly was the help that David Bonyer gave me. He was the minority whip, the Democratic whip at that time, a very, very busy person, but he chose to spend some time with me on several different occasions. I'm appreciative of that to this day. And I remember him in one of these conversations saying, well, you know, to make your life better around here, I would recommend 3 pieces. There's a little buffet off of what's called the members' dining room, but there's a little self-serve buffet, and only members are permitted in there, and it's a place where folks can just talk and be themselves. So there's that piece. Then there's exercise, and you ought to find it important to get some exercise, and also the interactions in the gym. It's a more collegial, open atmosphere. And then David said, finally, there's a spiritual piece, and there are a couple of different opportunities and groups to get together that way. Well, in my 8 years here, I have availed myself of the buffet and the food, and I'm still working on the exercise and the spiritual piece.
You were born in 1955 in Taiwan and moved with your parents to the United States in 1961. What can you tell us about immigrating to the United States? Was it a difficult transition for you and your parents?
Well, you know, Taiwan was a very important but transitional phase for our family, if you will, because my family's lived in the same place in China near Suzhou for about 500 years. My parents had intended to be in Taiwan only briefly for work, but life worked out otherwise. And eventually, through a long process, we immigrated to the United States. I think that for someone who is 6½, the immigration process was an easy one. I came to this country knowing absolutely no English. The neighbors remembered, but I have a hard time remembering that I would be running around with other kids. They'd be yakking away in English, and I'd be yakking away in Chinese, and everybody got along. So for a 6½-year-old, the process was quite easy. I think it was much tougher on my parents, learning a new language, learning a new culture, and also the intra-family dynamic of the kids becoming much more American, and the parents, of course, maintaining more of their cultural and linguistic momentum, and that inevitable divergence, if you will, or bridging that divergence.
You mentioned attending school and the fact that your father wasn't entirely pleased with your decision not to continue at the medical school. Tell us why you changed from going from not only medical school but to law school, but from Harvard to Yale. Why the change? Well,
Don, I always expected to become a scientist, and that's what I was planning to do. I very much focused on that academically, and I did a lot of lab work as an undergrad. And as a senior, you know, I had, well, by then I thought I wanted to do something hands-on to affect the world as it was configured. And so I thought about perhaps going to medical school. And on my lab bench, or the desk I had in the laboratory, I had applications for medical school and applications for the Peace Corps. And I decided that I would put off the Peace Corps, that if I went to medical school first, I'd be more useful as a Peace Corps volunteer in the future. So I went off to medical school. Now, sometimes you just have a little bit too much time on your hands. I took biochemistry at Stanford Medical School as an undergrad, so I placed out of biochemistry at Harvard. I designed my own course, working on some public health things, and I knocked on a lot of doors in Roxbury and in Brookline, a wealthy neighborhood on one side of the medical school and a relatively poor neighborhood on another side of the medical school. And I came to the realization I wanted to study how the medical school is affecting the welfare of folks around the area. And I sort of came to the conclusion that, you know, the people who didn't have enough income, they cared about jobs, they cared about police and fire, they cared about schools. And the folks in the wealthy part of town, if anything, they might be a little bit over-medicated. And being young and influenceable and wanting to change the world, you know, that took a lot of the wind out of my sails. I was reading the Boston Globe and the New York Times, and I noticed in the obituaries that the New York Times has great obituaries, and a lot of the people who were doing interesting things, things that I thought were important, had legal backgrounds. That's when I started thinking about law school, and decided to give it a go.
Is your father now reconciled to that fact and proud of you because of your success in law and politics?
I'm not sure. You're gonna have to interview him.
Well, let's take a moment and look at how you got involved in politics and public service. When did you decide to enter public service, and how had your previous experiences, education, and legal career prepared you for that step?
Well, I had always thought that public decisions are important, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, but I had never, I had not really decided to go into elective office or to try for elective office until I did. I'd never run for any office. It was August 8, 1997, and for various reasons on that day that I won't go into, my wife and I decided that it was a very worthwhile thing to try. Now, my prior experiences helped me prepare for that in a way that I didn't understand at the time that I went through those experiences. I did do one political campaign. I had volunteered on several, but in 1984, I had a multi-month period of my life when I could do anything that I wanted to, and I decided to go on the Gary Hart for President campaign when he was number 13 out of 14 candidates. This wasn't the much more well-known 88 campaign. As a result of that experience, because we were truly a children's crusade on that first Gary Hart campaign, I got to do a little bit of everything, including going around and starting organizations and opening up offices all around the country. That was a very important experience. A second very important experience was starting our own law firm in the mid-'80s. Leaving an institutional law firm and starting up on your own, or with a few other folks, that gets you sort of used to pushing out again. And also building a law practice is like building a campaign, except in slow motion. Or you can say that a campaign is like building a law practice, but on steroids. So those two experiences were very, very important. And I think finally that my education was helpful in this sense. It took away limitations. It made a lot of things seem possible, and particularly by personal example. In 1992, 4 of my classmates from Yale Law School ran for Congress. 3 of them won. From that example, I sort of thought, well, gee, they did it. And by golly, maybe it was something infectious, but my med school roommate for that 1 year I was in medical school, he ran for the United States Senate, Bill Frist, and ultimately became majority leader. And I had not heard his voice in 20 years. And then one day I was brushing my teeth, and it was NPR doing a story on his race, his first political race for the United States Senate. I thought, I recognize that voice. So the fact that you're in an environment that helps you take away your own internally framed limitations, and then also you see other people doing it, I think that really helps also.
Congressman, why did you decide to run for Congress in 1998? You've mentioned some of the circumstances that went into it. If there's anything more you remember about that first campaign, about building a campaign, and has your experience with campaigning changed since that first initial campaign?
Well, I decided to run for public office because I believe that public decisions are very, very important. And I learned that through the history of my family, the immigrant experience, and my personal experience with that. My parents actually grew up in 2 different parts of China, and they met because of the Japanese invasion of China between 1933 and 1945. The Chinese kept on moving everything to the interior, and my father's college was moved to the interior, merged with my mother's college. They wouldn't have met but for the war. When the war was over, they got 2 job offers. One was in Beijing and the other was in Taiwan. And they decided, let's go to Taiwan for a while and then we'll come back and sort of start our quote-unquote real lives. Now, they went to Taiwan in 1946, and the Chinese Civil War started again in earnest in 1947, so they were cut off from going back. And, civil wars and major wars, those are big items in history that folks know about. There's really the next phase of our family history and my personal experience that convinced me of the importance of public decisions to just about anybody. My dad decided when he couldn't take our family back to China that he wanted to come on to America. It took him several years to get the opportunity to come here as a foreign graduate student, and he came in 1955 when I was 4 months old. He had to leave my mom, my sisters, and I behind in Taiwan because of U.S. immigration law. And we might never have gotten the opportunity to come to the United States but for an election. The election of 1960, which John Kennedy won by the narrowest of margins. And the reason why that was so important was because my parents were on a very, very, very long waiting list. My sisters, my mom and I were on a very, very long waiting list, and my parents lived apart for 6 years. They almost gave up a couple of different times because they'd been apart for so long. And by the way, we were all pulling for the other side in that election. In Taiwan, we were pulling for Richard Nixon. History has many curves for us. But because John Kennedy won by the narrowest of margins, well, 3 months after he was sworn into office, he signed a little-known, little-remembered executive order which equalized the chances of coming to America. Before that, it was much easier to come to the U.S. from Europe and much harder from everywhere else. He equalized that opportunity. That was put into statute by Congress a few years later. But after he signed that executive order in, I believe, March or April of 1961, 6 months later, my sisters, my mom, and I were on the airplane coming here to the United States. So that little-known executive order literally changed my life, and I can cite several other instances where public decisions dramatically affected me, my family, or many of the people around me. So I do my work every day with the conviction that it matters to somebody, whether they're in New York or Portland, Oregon, or New Delhi or Shanghai. I had never run for public office before I ran for the United States Congress. And I'm not sure that anybody except my wife and a few of my closest friends thought that I had a ghost of a chance. But, I was 42 at the time, sold off all our liquid assets, put a second mortgage on the house, lived on about half that money, put the other half in the campaign, opened up a campaign office in the basement of our house. My wife had just had our first child, baby Matthew, and our first campaign employee was a recent graduate of the University of Wisconsin. He had just been out of school for a couple months, and he lived in our house just past our squalling baby. And I would leave work for him. He'd go to bed at a late hour, but I'd still leave work for him, outside his doorway in the hall. We'd start very early, but it was an easy thing to do because it was just a short walk down into my basement. And a campaign is it's like building a business or like building a law practice. You know, you need to have a product, which in the case of a campaign is both a candidate and a set of proposals. You need to have a distribution system. You need to have capital. In our case, raising about $1.5 million in about a year and a half. Unlike businesses, though, at the end of that time period, you take a test. And unless you have 50% plus one market share, you're out of the game. It's a very Darwinian process. I had never done it before. I'm gratified to have survived that first experience. Not very many people expected that. We won the primary by a narrow margin, and the general election went several days before it was decided, and ultimately won that one by 3 percentage points. So it was a very, very interesting set of experiences, and I think that it has probably formulated my mindset about never taking anything for granted. Of course, I think that's something I picked up from my earlier experiences in life. You always try your darndest. There's a test, and no one cares about the excuses afterwards. In the case of politics and elections, it's very binary. It's like a computer. It either comes up 0 or 1. You're either going to win or you lose, and nobody's very interested in the reasons why or any excuses.
Have your subsequent campaigns gotten easier or more complicated? Has the role of campaign finance been something that has personally affected you?
Well, I think that we've had some quite challenging elections, but the margins have gotten steadily larger, I believe. Campaign finance reform, I'm gratified to have support from whatever source it is, and certainly appreciate all of our supporters. But I think that unlike the usual pattern for incumbents, instead of having instead of having 3/4 PAC support and 1/4 individual support, our campaigns are the reverse. We have about 3/4 individual support and 1/4 PAC support. So that's just a straight work function. If you work at it, the individuals support you, but you have to ask them. The positive aspect of that is, I think that the individual donors, by and large, just want the best clean government that they can have. So having a lot of individual supporters affords you a remarkable degree of independence.
As the first Chinese American to serve in the House of Representatives, how has your heritage affected your political career and your public service in Congress?
Well, it has and it hasn't. I think that in terms of serving my constituents, there is net no impact. However, I do feel a certain significant responsibility to work hard, to do a good job. It's the Jackie Robinson effect, I guess. And perhaps most dramatically, in terms of the things that I care about, I can identify fairly clearly the 2 or 3 reasons why I'm here in Washington, D.C. And one of them is because I care about democracy and human rights and the rule of law everywhere in the world, but especially China. And it was the dramatic events of Tiananmen and the following events that one of my driving reasons to be here in Washington, D.C. is to promote democracy and human rights and the rule of law. And in more recent times, post 9/11, and pretty much all the time, but especially more dramatically post 9/11, that's an important domestic issue also, to maintain our framework of civil liberties when it's under more pressure.
Congressman Wu, you are currently a member of the executive board for the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, which you chaired from 2001 to 2004. What can you tell us about the caucus and your experiences with it?
Well, I was deeply honored to chair the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, and it's a good organization to be part of. We talk about a number of issues that are of national importance to Asian Pacific American, and we also try to bring those issues to other members of Congress to encourage their understanding. We have also worked very closely with the Congressional Black Caucus and the Hispanic Caucus as a tri-caucus effort. The interesting difference between the APA caucus and the Hispanic caucus and the CBC is that while a lot of the Hispanic and African American members are from minority districts, that is, districts that are majority African American or majority Hispanic, I don't think there's a congressional district in America that is majority Asian. So there are some differences there, and perhaps a natural inclination toward bridge building.
You spoke about your fascination with policy decisions and how it impacts people. And of course, Congress is an important role in the making of policy of the federal government. And in order to do its work, members of different parties, members with divergent views, have to work together. In their recent book, The Broken Branch, two veteran congressional scholars argue that increasing partisanship in Congress has undermined the ability of the institution to play its role in public policy. Mm-hmm. Have you noticed signs of increasing or decreasing partisanship in Congress during your terms?
This discussion of partisanship has come up repeatedly during my 8 years. It is, I think, a challenge and a problem now. People who have been here longer refer to a different era when perhaps there was less partisanship, but I'm not sure that, just as in history, the good old days, if you examine them closely, they're not as good as perhaps people remember them. I'm not sure if the less partisan days were as less partisan as some people would like to remember them. But I do think that it is a problem today, and I think there are several different components of it that contribute toward it or that can ameliorate it. If members of Congress, if more members of Congress would live in Washington during the session and then go home during the recesses, I think that that would be helpful because, you know, when you rub elbows with each other more, you're much less likely to say unnecessary and mean things about each other. Joe Nolenberg of Michigan has a townhouse 3 or 4 doors down from my townhouse in Washington, D.C. And Joe and I are neighbors. We may or may not agree on 3 to 5 issues, but I would never say a mean thing about Joe, and I don't think that Joe would ever say a mean thing about me. So I think that additional contact and perhaps non-work related contact would be a helpful thing. Having studied biology a chunk of my life, I think there is a relationship between form and function, and the fact that every committee is divided in half, Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other. The floor is similarly divided. I think that that contributes toward it, that if we were to mix things up more, that perhaps would take a little bit of the edge off. And finally, I think that there is a personal responsibility component. That is, there's a contribution that each of us can make, either toward nonpartisanship or bipartisanship on the one hand, or toward partisanship on the other. If each of us were to reach out and build relationships both within our caucus and across the partisan divide, I think that's an important component of solving that puzzle. But I do think that the partisanship right now affects both our ability to get some types of work done, and it also affects the quality of our experience here in Washington, D.C. We would have a better experience if it were a less bitter environment.
In terms of legislation, are there perhaps a couple of bills that you've been involved with that have had a very personal meaning to you that you can talk to us about?
Well, right now I chair a subcommittee on technology and innovation. This is very important to me because this is the area of law in which I practiced before I came to Washington, D.C. And back then, I pretty much painted within the lines that lawmakers had drawn for us. And now, as the subcommittee chair with the jurisdiction of this area of technology transfer, I get to perhaps affect the lines that delineate the boundaries and what folks can do. So this tech transfer area and we just legislated on it today, and we will be doing more, holding a hearing on it tomorrow, and moving things to the floor probably in May. This is very, very important to me. In terms of crucial votes, you know, I mentioned the importance of democracy and human rights, and that applies, of course, both at home and abroad. But the China vote in my freshman year was a watershed experience. There are many people who have said one thing about China and human rights before coming to Washington, D.C., and then may have had a change of heart when they got here. The most influential economic interests in my congressional district were all strongly in favor of most favored nation trading status with China. I stuck with my campaign commitments and my values. This is, the nearest thing I can think of is perhaps someone from Washington State voting against something that both Microsoft and Boeing care about very much, and that doesn't seem to happen very much around this town.
Congressman, these words by Daniel Webster are inscribed in the House chamber. Let us develop the resources of our land, call forth its powers, build up its institutions, promote all its great interests, and see whether we also in our day may not perform something worthy to be remembered. Well, as a member of Congress, you're a member of a very select group. You're part of history. Over and above the things you have accomplished or will yet accomplish, how would you like to be remembered?
Well, let me list things in two different ways. One in terms of how I approach things. And in terms of how I approach things, I hope to be remembered as someone who lived and voted his values and who worked darn hard toward goals. In terms of the specifics, in terms of the specific accomplishments, I have a very clear notion of why I'm here in Washington. I serve the interests of 700,000 people plus, and all of their issues are important. But the two issues that spin my wheels, that drive my willingness to be 3,000 miles away from home, and to pour so much energy into this are two. One is to see great research and education in the United States in general and in Oregon in particular. Great research and education. And the other is to strongly promote democracy and human rights and the rule of law, to protect it here in the United States, to promote it all around the world, but specifically with regard to China and the Far East.
Thank you.
Well, you know,
Yes, sir.
I also want to thank you for this opportunity to reflect and to look at the larger picture, which is something that we don't get to do very often around this town.